So if you've got any questions, please use the chat facility. Grant and I are going to be monitoring that for any questions that come up. We will save them for a Q&A session at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to come to you. You can ask your question at the end of the presentation. There's no time limit on the session, and again, thanks to Flow sponsorship, we've got a fully professional subscription, so we can be here literally until the early hours if it goes on. It's a bank holiday. Who's working? And again, finally, if you think you would like to give us a talk or you've got a suggestion for a future topic, please do get in touch. There's now a specific forum for the Stargazine section, so there'll be an opportunity there for you. Okay, enough of the admin. On to our speaker for this evening. Steve Richards is perhaps best known to you all for being the Sky at Night's equipment specialist, the Scope Doctor. But as you again probably know, he's a very experienced astrophotographer. He's published regularly and was the winner of an APOD award back in 2016 with his excellent IC5040, the Pelican Nebula image, and superb it is too. He's the author of the Guide to Image Processing in Photoshop, Dark Art or Magic Bullet. Copy sits on my shelf, I hope it does on yours. And of course, the highly successful Making Every Photon Count, which is the topic of tonight's talk. If you are interested in taking steps into astro imaging, Steve will ensure you have got all the information you need to get into this fun aspect of astronomy. So it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce the first speaker for Stargazine, Steve Richards. So I think, Steve, now if you share your screen.
Okay, I think my screen should now be shared, okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, as long as it actually flips onto the next slide, then I've picked the correct thing. Okay, thanks, Daz, for the welcome and the introduction. My talk tonight is an introduction to deep sky imaging for observers. It could also be described as an introduction to deep sky imaging for beginners as well. So we're not going to go into great depth about complex processing or anything like that. This really is a starter talk for people who are thinking of getting into deep sky imaging. Now, deep sky imaging has to be the craziest idea that any imager or photographer could ever have dreamed up. First of all, we're standing on a moving platform, which means that we have to pan to follow the objects as they move across the sky. The objects themselves are so small and so far away that we need long focal lengths just to see them. Because they're so dim, we need wide open apertures, very, very long exposures, and we certainly can't use flash. So, absolute madness, you might think, but welcome to my world. Now, with all these problems to contend with, it's really not unusual to hear an astrophotographer swear. And in fact, I shall be using the F word several times during the course of this evening. In fact, I would have been using several F words if the slide had actually moved on. So I'm going to try and find out why it hasn't. And hey presto, we're in. Okay, these are the 6 F words that I will actually be using. Find, focus, frame, follow, film, and finish. If anything else goes wrong during the course of this, I may well use the other F word that I mentioned earlier. If you can satisfy the needs of each of these 6 F words, you'll be well on your way to being able to capture half reasonable deep sky images. So I'm going to go through each of them in turn. But before I do that, I'm not sure of who's actually on. Therefore, some of you may be absolute beginners to astronomy generally. So I thought it might be quite useful if we find out what do we actually mean by deep sky objects, because the imaging processes for deep sky are very different from those from solar system work, for example. So I produced a little video, and as is normal with the video, I've got a little soundtrack to it, and because I've got a Moog synthesizer at home, I thought it would be really cool to put some really spacey type, background sounds to this. But then I thought about all the numerous, literally thousands and thousands of excellent posts on SGL, and I thought, this bunch are far too discerning for something as cheesy as space music. So I thought instead that I would treat you to something just a little bit more traditional. Now, those who know me well will have a horrible idea of what's coming up. For the rest of you, I would simply suggest that you set your speakers to stun. Well, there you go. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. I assume the sound did come out, Grant? Nod from Grant would be handy. Perfect. Before I go on to the actual F words themselves, I thought I'd just have a quick word with you about mounting, because this often causes some confusion. For example, we all know, especially this will apply to observers as well, that the stars above us rotate, which means that we have to follow them, as I mentioned earlier. And this is an excellent way of showing that rotation. This is just a long exposure photograph with a wide angle camera aimed at the North Celestial Pole. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of movement going on over time. And that movement, of course, could very easily result in blurring. So it's very necessary to track and follow these objects as they move across the sky and we're taking the photographs. Which means, unfortunately, that an excellent observing instrument like this one, this is a 10-inch Newtonian, is absolutely useless for deep sky astrophotography. Fantastic for observing, but of no use at all for deep sky imaging. Now, you may think that one of these little chaps would be really good, and I could mention a couple of shops locally that would happily sell you one of these for deep sky imaging, but it would not be suitable for the purpose. And the reason for that is that a telescope like this moves in discrete movements. It moves a little bit to the right, a little bit up, a little bit to the right, a little bit up, a little bit to the right, a little bit up. Great if you're an observer, as far as your eye will tell you, it's tracking absolutely beautifully. But from an imaging point of view, it's an absolute disaster. And this is the reason. If you imagine that the little rectangles that we're seeing here, these red rectangles, have been set up so that you're looking at a galaxy and a couple of stars. And you're tracking those as they move across the sky. But you can see that very rapidly, although because the camera has stayed in exactly the same orientation, because it's moving right, up, etc., the object itself has rotated within the field of view. And of course, that rotation will cause blurring. It's called rather originally field rotation. And you can see that that would be quite a disaster if you were taking long exposures. So that's why an all-azimuth telescope is of no use for deep sky astrophotography. I suppose if you could argue very, very bright objects, very, very short exposures, you could get away with it. But for anything more than that, it's really not suitable. Which moves us on to an equatorial mount. And an equatorial mount rotates around an axis that goes through this line here. And it matches the rotation of the Earth. And so the telescope itself moves in an arc, which means that it accurately tracks the objects, keeping the camera at the correct orientation all the way through, as demonstrated here. So we start off in exactly the same point, but instead of the telescope moving in discrete up and down, left and right movements, you can see that it's actually moving in a nice neat arc, which means that the galaxy and the star simulation that we've got here stay in the same place all the way through the imaging session. So this is why an equatorial mount is very, very important. So a little bit of background into the sort of mount that you need. If we now move on then to the 6 F words themselves, and the first one is find. Now you might think, well, of course you've got to find the object, it's self-evident. But in fact, it's not quite as easy as you might imagine. Whereas an observer can use an eyepiece to zoom in on the object that they want, you can't do that with a camera because there is no eyepiece. So instead, you've got to come up with a sensible method of locating your object accurately. And of course, a computerized go-to mount will help you enormously, but you've still got to be absolutely sure that you've located the image correctly. And I found when I started off that one of the best ways to do this was to just take a continuous sequence of 6-second exposures, use my hand controller to take me to a nice bright star somewhere near the object that I actually wanted to image. Now, I've talked about the hand control just there, but you can also, of course, use something like EQ mod, which is a computer conversion that allows you to control a Skywatcher mount completely by computer. And you can see here that I've got a planetarium program, and I've got a hand controller, if you like, a software virtual hand controller. Either will work for this. And so if we take an example, let's just say if I wanted to image M57, which is a planetary nebula. Here it is, down here. Very, very small, not particularly easy to find, and certainly not easy to find with a camera because although it's a relatively bright object, it's still relatively dim. But I do know that by looking at my planetarium software, there's a very, very bright star nearby. This is Vega. And so Vega would be an excellent start for getting your mount correctly aligned with the object that you want to image. And so the first thing you would do is tell your telescope to slew to Vega, and you would then center it, synchronize it, and then you would know that if you were to do that short hop down to M57, there's every chance that M57 would be really nicely centered in the middle of your screen, which is exactly what you're looking for. However, of course, there's one other thing that M57 can do for us. That Vega can do for us while we're on it. And that is, we could use it to focus with. Because one of the big issues with deep sky astrophotography is that you can't use the autofocus that you get with, say, a digital SLR camera. You have to find, again, a different kind of strategy so you can do accurate focus. Well, we've now got a nice bright star, Vega, right in the middle of our field of view. Ideal object to focus on. Now, if you've got a Newtonian or any other kind of telescope that has got spider vane at the front, you can use the diffraction spikes that this causes to focus very, very accurately. Now, you'll notice that when you look at this captured image of Vega, that it has got a double display, if you like, of the spider vane, indicating that it's out of focus. But if we get correct focus, you can see that we've now just got a single display of the spider vane. We now know that the object is nicely in focus. If I just go back a second, you can also have a look at the smaller stars around there, and you can see that in this photograph, they're looking a bit blurry, and here they're much sharper. So you can also use the blurred stars around the object as a reference point if you're using a refractor. But luckily, there's an even better way of doing the focus, and that is to use a thing called a Bartinov mask. Now, a Bartinov mask will work on any kind of telescope, but they're particularly good on refractors. And what's clever about them is that they produce a diffraction set rather like those that we've just seen produced by a Newtonian telescope with its spider vane, but it produces a very, very specific pattern. And that pattern results in a cross with a horizontal line. And if you adjust your focus while you continue those 6-second exposures that I mentioned earlier on, you can see the cross and the line moving against one another. And when those two are perfectly aligned, in other words, the cross is bisected by the horizontal line, you know that you have as near as darn it perfect focus. And this is what happens when you do rack the focus in and out. you can see that the line doesn't bisect at the moment. Move in a bit further, we've gone in a little bit too far. Wind back a little bit, we're almost perfectly in focus. When I say almost, just to demonstrate how accurate this can be, that looks at a quick glance as though it's a perfect bisection, but in fact it's not. You'll see that the horizontal line's a little bit too high. But a Bartonov mask will allow you to very, very accurately focus your telescope. So a really, really useful device. So Vega has done two things for us so far. It's given us an in to where M57 is, and it's allowed us to get a very accurate focus. We could, of course, if we were doing more advanced work, use an autofocuser, but the use of this is probably outside the scope of this particular discussion. But if you really got into deep sky astrophotography, you might decide that you really would like to do an automated focus as well. If you were just using a camera and an ordinary camera lens, you wouldn't be able to use autofocus, but you would be able to focus manually. You could make up a Bartonov mask, such as the one I've already shown. But if you're using camera lenses, you'll find that you will have field curvature. And so a very clever little tip for ensuring that you get the best possible star shapes is, rather than focus a star in the middle of the field of view, just take one just off at about this position that we're seeing here, this third position. And if you focus on that star, you'll have a good spread of focus across the whole field of view. So that's a great way of focusing a wide field instrument. So the final bit of using Vega, we now have it synchronized with our telescope. Telescope and the real sky are talking to each other. They're happy with what they've found. So we can now command the telescope to go to M57, and we can be pretty sure that it's going to be right in the middle of the field of view. We can take a very simple, so maybe 10-second shot, something like that. I've actually used 6 seconds for this one, and quite clearly the ring nebula M57 is there right in the middle of the field of view. So we've achieved our goal. We can, in essence, get on with the rest of the imaging. But that's fine for an object like M57, which is circular. What about if we've got something much more complex? So we move on to the next of our F words, and that's framing. If we have a look at this object, for example, this is part of the Veil Nebula. The object at the bottom of the screen is the Witch's Broom Nebula, and the triangular piece just above it is the is Pickering's triangle. If we wanted to get that very, very tight framing properly resolved, that would be quite a task, because it's not easy to see these objects unless you take quite a deep photograph. But by using planetarium software and overlaying a facsimile of what your sensor looks like, you can position your telescope very, very accurately to get the framing that you want. You can also resolve the orientation of the camera that you need. So a planetarium program like Carte du Ciel is a very, very valuable tool for ensuring that you get your framing correct. And you can then, again, take a test image just to see how you've done. Now, I appreciate this is a very rough image, but it's only intended to make sure that we've got all the parts that we want. But quite clearly we have. Here's the Witch's Broom. Here's Pickering's triangle. So we now know that we've got our framing absolutely right for quite a complex object. So planetarium software, especially something free like Carte du Ciel, is a great way of ensuring that you get decent framing. Just to show you what happens when you've actually captured some half reasonable data of the same object. This is just an HA image, but as you can see, the framing has worked out really nicely. So framing, very, very important. The title of this talk is Making Every Photon Count. The last thing you want to be doing is throwing away a lot of your data because your object is incorrectly positioned. So if you can get it properly framed in the first place, you can make use of every photon that you've actually managed to capture. So moving on then to our next F word, and this is follow. I've already discussed, and you'll already know if you're an existing astronomer, that the sky is moving above us. Well, if we're going to take long exposures, we need to follow the movement very, very accurately. So following is a very, very important aspect of deep sky astrophotography. And this is what you get if you take a photograph and you don't have your mount tracking. Within a very, very short period of time, M57 and the stars around it have exited stage left, or in this case, they've exited off the bottom of the screen. Well, you'd expect that to happen if you weren't tracking correctly. But you'd be very disappointed to learn that this was taken with my elderly EQ6 mount. And you can see that on a 300-second exposure, I've got some quite obvious star trailing. And that's a real pain. And the EQ6 is not a bad mount. It's just that it's really not engineered well enough to take 5-minute exposures and to still maintain very, very accurate tracking. So we need to have a strategy in place for that. Now this is a very important part of any observer or astrophotographer's arsenal. This is the Mark I eyeball. Now, I'd like to say this is one of my eyes. In fact, I'd like to say it's one of my wife's eyes, but it isn't. But the Mark I eyeball can be very, very useful. Imagine if you were to attach a second telescope to your imaging telescope and put an eyepiece in that second telescope with a crosshair on it, and you were to center a star on that crosshair, and then you would use your left and right up-down controls to keep that star perfectly centered. If that second telescope is connected to your main imaging scope, then any corrections that you make for that guide scope, as it's called, will be represented correctly in the main imaging scope. So we've got a little closed loop here. We've got a system whereby we can continue taking our main image, but we can correct for any problems with the mount not tracking correctly by using our Mark I eyeball. Now I can tell you I've done this. I've done this for over the years for several hours. And I'm here to tell you that it is the most awful experience I've ever had in imaging. It really is very, very frustrating. It's like trying to fly a helicopter using a jelly mold. So I really wouldn't recommend that you do anything more than just try it just for the fun of it and then say, thank you, I've done that, and move on. However, if you were to put in the hours, this is what you would result in. You'd get nice round stars, and of course if the stars are round, then the object that you're photographing will be properly in focus. It won't be smeared, it won't be trailed. So guiding becomes a very, very important part of long exposure deep sky astrophotography. Luckily, you don't have to use a Mark I eyeball. Here's a typical setup. This is a Skywatcher ED80 imaging telescope, and above that, an ST80, which I'm using here as a guide scope. And you'll see that it's firmly attached to the top of this instrument. You'll notice though, here, I don't have an eyepiece, I've actually got something else. And that something else is a little imaging camera. Same size as an eyepiece. But what is really clever about this imaging camera is that by taking photographs through the second telescope and feeding the result of each capture to a clever piece of software which determines whether the stars have moved or not, you have an auto guider. So it does everything that your eye did without the frustration, the tears, and the pain. So auto guiding is really the way to go if you want to do deep sky astrophotography. You don't have to have a second telescope. Here is another way of doing it. This is using a thing called an off-axis guider. If you imagine that this is my field flattener, this is my deep sky imaging camera, this is my filter wheel. This clever little device here is called an off-axis guider. And in essence, it's got a little prism in it. The prism picks off a little bit of the light that's coming in through the telescope, sends it off at right angles up into the little camera. And so that little camera is then taking pictures, feeding its output to auto-guiding software, which determines whether the stars have moved or not. If they have moved, it makes a correction. If it makes a correction, you can see that because it's closely coupled to this camera will also be noting those corrections. So that's another way of auto-guiding. There are external auto-guiding systems that you can get. This is one by Skywatcher called a SIN guider. A lot of people who use digital SLR cameras use this because it's very portable, very self-contained. Personally, I prefer a separate telescope with a proper guider. I suppose it's unfair to say this isn't a proper guider, but it's nowhere near as easy to use as an ordinary guide camera and some special software. So we've now got our, we found it, which is a good start. We've got it in focus, we've got it nicely framed. We're now accurately tracking it as it moves across the sky because we're doing auto guiding. So maybe we can get on and start filming it. Now, obviously, I've had to be a little bit contrived here to get yet another F word, because of course people don't use film these days. They use digital cameras of one sort or another. But let's call it film from now on. Now, there are three different kinds of camera, essentially. There's a digital SLR camera, there's CCD Astro camera, and more recently, there are CMOS Astro cameras. And these are typical examples of the three different types. If we have a look, first of all, at digital SLR imaging, this is a very popular way to start deep sky imaging. A lot of people already have a digital SLR camera in the home anyway. They're not ideal, but it's a great way to start. The advantages of having a digital SLR camera to image with is that they're completely self-contained. They have a large sensor, which means you can take higher resolution images. You can take long exposures. Most of them have got what is known as a bulb position, B, which allows you to take unlimited length exposures. Because it's a digital SLR camera, you can remove the lens and you can therefore place the camera directly onto a telescope, so that in fact the telescope becomes yet another lens, if you like, for the camera. And the cost is very reasonable, especially for the size of sensor that you get. However, there are some disadvantages, and the disadvantages are that for the camera to work well during the daytime, it has to have an infrared filter. But those infrared filters can be fairly wide in their coverage, which means that they can actually encroach into the areas that we actually want to capture images from. For example, into the hydrogen alpha area, which is a very important part of the wavelength for deep sky imaging. The other problem with digital SLR cameras is that their sensors can be relatively noisy. You don't notice this during ordinary work, terrestrial type work, but when you're taking 5, 10, 15-minute exposures, sensor noise becomes quite a problem. But in conclusion, they're a pretty good all-rounder. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't start off with one. You can help matters along by buying a thing called an intervalometer. You can get these on eBay for £20 or less. Essentially, you can program this up so it'll take a whole sequence of images. So you could set the thing running. You could set it to take 30 10-minute exposures. You can go and have a coffee, watch EastEnders, whatever it is that really turns you on. They fit directly onto your telescope using a little adapter. These adapters are readily available. Here's one fitted to a Newtonian telescope. They can go straight onto a refractor. This one's attached to an ED80. So a very versatile device. But just to demonstrate the sort of issues that you get because of that infrared filter, the image on the left was taken with a standard relatively old digital SLR camera, and those were the colors that I got because so much of the red had been absorbed by the built-in infrared filter. If you contrast that with the image on the right-hand side, which was taken with a typical Astro-CCD camera, you can see that the colors are very, very different. And that's because an Astro-CCD camera doesn't have a savage infrared filter built into it. Give you an idea of the sort of attenuation of the signal that you get. If you have a look at the green trace here, this is on a standard Canon EOS camera. You'll see that the very important hydrogen alpha is chopped off right down to about 22%. So only 22% of the hydrogen alpha light is getting through, which is why that image that I showed just now is showing very blue and not very red. However, you can modify a digital SLR camera by removing the existing filter and putting in an Astro conversion filter. BARDA make these. If we'll have a look now at the blue trace, you'll see that it's now encompassing not only the hydrogen alpha, but the sulfur 2 as well, giving you a very, very useful camera for deep sky. Still not going to be cooled, but you are going to be able to capture a huge amount of data in the really important emission areas of hydrogen alpha and sulfur 2. Just to give an idea of what happens if you modify one of these cameras, the image at the top was before modification. The image at the bottom was having removed the standard filter from the Canon and then put a BARDA replacement infrared filter in there. You still need an infrared filter, otherwise you'd get star bloating. It's just that you don't want one that is so broad reaching. You'll see that the image has very much reddened up. And of course, that is a disadvantage, if you like, of modifying your digital SLR camera, because you've now got to start messing about with the white balance to get it back where you want it for ordinary daytime use. But if you do the conversion or get someone else to do it for you, you get a very, very useful, low-cost deep sky imaging camera. And here's a typical image. This was taken years and years ago. It's one of my earliest images. But as you can see, it's captured an awful lot of the red that is required. This was done with the modified digital SLR camera. Oh yes, the dog cluster. Now the dog cluster is really just to give you a hint of a final advantage to having a digital SLR camera. Having bought all that telescope equipment, to try and get a camera under the radar as well might just be a step too far. But if you can convince your other half, as I was able to here, that that camera could be used for all sorts of other things, like imaging her dogs, then you've got another way of getting hold of equipment without having to be too sneaky about it. Now moving on to Astro-CCD and CMOS cameras. These are specifically designed for deep sky work, and the advantages of using these are that they have a very, very sensitive sensor. You normally get a reasonable size sensor if you spend a reasonable amount of money, but really big sensors can be stupidly expensive. So you do need to temper that in your budgeting. Really big sensors for CCD cameras and CMOS cameras can be really quite expensive. Long exposures are certainly possible. That's what they were born to do. There's no infrared filter built in, but of course you do need to add one somewhere in the imaging train a little bit later on. But very, very importantly, they have Peltier cooling. Now, Peltier cooling is basically a little refrigerator which sits behind the sensor, and it cools it down quite dramatically. I mean, on my own camera, I can actually cool down to minus 50 degrees centigrade. As it happens, I don't. I only cool down to about minus 20. But the advantage of cooling your camera down, or rather cooling your sensor down, is that you dramatically reduce the noise that is produced by the sensor itself. The disadvantages of an Astro-CCD or CMOS camera is that you require a PC to control it. Notice there's no viewfinder, no buttons, no focusing buttons, no aperture buttons. It's just a raw sensor held in a tube. However, these are excellent for deep sky imaging. There are two types of Astro-CCD or CMOS camera that you can buy. You can buy a one-shot color, which means that it will actually capture images in one shot, color images in one shot, or you can buy a mono camera and a set of filters that will allow you to build up a color image. However, it's important to note that a one-shot camera, or a one-shot color camera, and a DSLR camera for that matter, are in fact mono sensors. It's just a mono camera, but the one-shot color cameras have got a series of filters built into the top of them. And so in essence, what you're doing is you're capturing some red data, some green data, and some blue data. And the camera itself, if you're using a digital DSLR camera, is internally processing that image to produce a color image, as demonstrated here. And the way that these one-shot color and digital DSLR cameras work is if you imagine that each of those little gray blocks is a pixel, and sublimated on top of that by a process known as dye sublimation are little color filters in a matrix, and that matrix is called a Bayer matrix. So you can see that some sensors have got green filters on them, some have got blue, some have got red. By a clever piece of trickery using software, the image is converted from a mono image into a color image by correctly reading which of these pixels had green light falling on it, which had red, which had blue, etc., etc., to produce a color image. Now, these cameras will also fit straight onto your telescope. Here it is fitted onto a Newtonian telescope. You can also swing things around and use an ordinary camera lens with an Astro-CCD camera. This gives you some fantastic opportunities for taking really wide field images with lots of resolution, lots of sensitivity. Great way of doing wide field imaging. Now, I mentioned earlier about the mono camera and using filters to produce a color image. Well, the easiest way to do this is by using a filter wheel. And here is a typical filter wheel. This is Attic EFW2. And you can see that it's got, I think it's nine filter slots. So you could populate this with luminance, red, green, blue, hydrogen alpha, oxygen 3, sulfur 2, hydrogen beta. You could have a very, very powerful imaging system for your mono camera. This is the camera that I use, and essentially what you're looking at the back there, that's the a lot of the back, what's at the back is the actual cooling system itself. There are two fans there. This one is, however, is a very strange shape. As you can see, it's got a great big sort of box shape. That's because the filter itself is actually, or rather the filter wheel is built in. So you've got a camera with a filter wheel. And right at the very top of it, there's a little port here. Well, I mentioned earlier the off-axis guider, onto which you put a guide camera. Well, this has got an off-axis guider built in as well. So sadly, rather expensive, but a very, very nice all-in-one camera and guiding system, complete with a set of filter wheels as well. I mentioned the filters that you could populate with. These are the typical ones, red, green, and blue. For ordinary color work, hydrogen alpha, hydrogen beta, oxygen 3, and sulfur 2 for narrowband imaging. I'll come on to what we mean by narrowband imaging a little bit further on during the talk. But here's a typical RGB image. This was taken with a mono camera and RGB filters combined together in software. In this case, I was using Photoshop to produce a color image, and exactly the same for this one here. So these are typical targets that you would want to image with either a one-shot color camera or a mono camera with red, green, and blue filters. These are the wavelengths of the red, green, and blue. But it's quite significant that if we now just do a little overlay onto this, you'll see that the hydrogen alpha, the oxygen 3, the hydrogen beta, and the sulfur 2 lie quite firmly in different areas of the spectrum. You'll notice that HA is almost slap bang in the middle of the red. You'll notice that the hydrogen beta is quite definitely in the blue area. But we've got a very interesting situation with O3. And you'll see that O3 is right on the cusp, if you like, between being blue or being green. We can make great use of this because, in fact, we can actually use an O3 filter as either and or a blue filter. And we can use the hydrogen alpha narrowband filter as a red filter because it's very neatly right bang in the center of the red part of the spectrum. To give you an idea of how this actually pans out in real life, if we have a look at the top right-hand image here, you'll see this was taken with a one-shot color camera. This is the Mexico region of NGC 7000. And these are the typical of the sort of colors that you would expect to see. However, if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner, the same object has been captured now using a hydrogen alpha, an O3, and a hydrogen beta filter. So the hydrogen alpha is now being mapped to red, the O3 has been mapped to green, and the hydrogen beta has been mapped to blue. And you can see that it produces a reasonable facsimile of the one-shot color image. But I hope that you can also see that there is actually more detail in the image. Likewise, if we look at the top left-hand corner, we've used a sulfur 2 filter, which we've mapped to red, a hydrogen alpha filter that we've mapped to green, and an oxygen 3 filter that we've mapped to blue. And this is what is known as the Hubble palette, because it's exactly the same filter structure that they use in the Hubble Space Telescope. As you can see, the colors, though, are wildly different from those that you would expect to see in an ordinary image. However, again, look at the amount of detail that you're able to capture. Images captured using this process are known as false color images, whereas the one-shot color camera image, of course, is, if you like, natural colors. Finally, at the bottom right-hand corner, I mentioned to you earlier that the O3 was right on the cusp of change between the blue and the green. Well, here, I've actually used the O3 as the green channel. I've used it again, exactly the same data as the blue channel, and I've used the hydrogen alpha, which was right in the middle of the red part of the spectrum, as the red. And I produced a color image using Photoshop, which again shows a remarkable similarity to the real natural colors of a one-shot color camera, but again, with much more detail. Narrowband tends to give much more detailed images. So as you can see, narrowband can be a very, very interesting way of representing well-known objects. Here's exactly the same setup, again, but processed a different way. I mentioned that when you use narrowband filters, you're actually using or producing false color images. Well, once you accept that you're producing false color, anything goes. And so I've used hydrogen alpha, oxygen 3, and the same oxygen 3 a second time to produce this, if you like, RGB color image. But I've slewed the colors so that they give me the maximum amount of contrast and the maximum amount of detail. Now, okay, I accept these aren't natural looking colors at all, but what I like about them is the amount of detail that they've produced, and to my eye, still a very pretty image as well. And something else you'll notice is how tiny the stars are. I haven't done anything special with these stars. I haven't removed them and reduced them and poked them back in again. This is a byproduct of using narrowband filters. You get nice small stars, which can be quite an advantage. Here's another typical image when it comes up using narrowband imaging. This is the Planetary Nebula M57. You don't normally see it like this. You normally just see the core part. But by using very, very long exposures, these were all half-hour exposures and lots of them, you can see that I've managed to tease out all sorts of detail in the outer halo using again just hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3 data. Very, very powerful technique. Earlier on, I was demonstrating capturing data for the Veil Nebula and making sure it was correctly framed. Well, here's a picture of the Veil Nebula itself. Again, this was taken in narrowband, and this is a full set of colors, but I've tried to make them represent the colors that you would get if you were taking an RGB image. But what is nice is using exactly the same data, but processing it a totally different way, you get another very detailed image, but with completely different colors. For me, both of these are completely valid images, but they show that exactly the same data processed in a different way can produce a remarkably different kind of image. This is part of the Elephant Trunk Nebula, again taken in narrowband. And what is particularly nice about this, again, is the size of the stars. If you have a look at a lot of images of this object, you'll see that there are 2 stars here. They frequently get blurred into one, simply because it's very, very difficult to separate them. But by using narrowband imaging, it's actually much easier to get tinier stars and therefore to show them as individual members rather than as a, if you like, a bright blob. So a very, very powerful tool. And of course, you don't have to produce color images. Here is exactly the same object itself, simply as a black and white image. Quite often when I post up a black and white image like this, a couple of people say, oh, I look forward to seeing it when it's in color. Well, I don't always do color. I really like black and white images as well. For me, they have the same appeal that a terrestrial photographer would have if they were doing high key black and white imaging. So don't feel that you've absolutely got to produce color images, because a black and white image like this produces a tremendous amount of detail. And in many ways, that's part of the joy of deep sky photography. Now, another cunning thing that you can do is combine images taken with RGB and with narrowband. For a while, I ran a dual imaging system. I don't do that anymore, in fact, but there was a time when I had a color camera on one of my telescopes and a mono camera with filters on the other. And I used to take narrowband with the mono camera and ordinary color images with the one-shot color camera. And the advantage of that is as follows. Here's a fairly ordinary picture of the Butterfly Nebula. I mean, it's quite pretty, but it's not greatly detailed. I hate that really bright star there. I had great trouble processing that. In the end, I just had to leave it as it was. But just try and remember the shape that we're seeing there of the Butterfly Nebula in the center. Here is zooming right in on that now, but using a hydrogen alpha filter. And you see we've got a tremendous amount of detail now that is missing from that much wider field. But the joy here is that we combine the two together, and we're using the color from the one-shot color image, and we're using the hydrogen alpha, if you like, as a lumen channel to give us the detail. We now have the best of both worlds. We've got a really detailed image, but with much more natural colors. So quite easy to mix and match between narrowband and ordinary broadband, if you like, imaging. The final part is called finishing. Again, I've had to use a bit of artistic license to make sure I had my final F word. But once you've actually captured your images, of course, they're just sitting there as data. You've got to do quite a lot of processing to complete the image. And these are typical things that you would need to do. You would need to calibrate your images to get rid of some of the artifacts that are captured simply in the process of capturing the data. You need to generate the color image from the raw data. You need to take the best of the images that you've got and to stack them together so that you can increase the signal to noise ratio. You might want to lose light pollution, something I suffer from greatly here. You might want to adjust the brightness and the contrast. You might want to increase the color saturation. You might find you've got a bit of a color cast, so you want to adjust the color balance. And you might find you want to do some sharpening as well. So these are all typical things that you would do in the finishing section, also known as post-processing. We just look at the very first part of this now. As well as capturing the main images, you also need to capture what are known as calibration images. And this is the first of them. This is known as a bias frame. And a bias frame is a photograph taken at the shortest possible exposure with the telescope capped. And all it's doing is capturing the noise, if you like, from the sensor as it's being downloaded. Because as it's being downloaded from the camera, various artifacts are produced, and those artifacts will be in every single frame that you take. So if you can subtract a facsimile of those artifacts from your image, you can remove a lot of the faults that are in there. For example, I don't know if you can see it here. I can get my mouse to come into the right area. There it is. Do you see there's a line going down here? This is a line of dead pixels. Well, by applying a bias frame to my image, special software will remove that artifact from the image. So bias frames, very, very important. The second kind of calibration frame that you need to do is a dark frame. Now, a dark frame is an image that is taken at exactly the same exposure length as the actual images that you've taken, but again with the telescope capped. So here you're capturing just the sensor noise, because even a cooled sensor will still produce noise. And of course, if you can subtract this noise from each of your images, then you'll end up with a much cleaner image. So a dark frame is a way of, if you like, cleaning up your images from the noise that is generated simply by the capture process. And there's a third kind of frame which is known as a flat frame. Now, a flat frame is an exposure that is taken at exactly the same focus position as your ordinary images, but taken with something like pieces of paper or a white t-shirt that you stretch over the front of the telescope, and you just capture the light cone as it comes through. And that light cone will contain all sorts of useful data. Like, for example, over in the corners, it will show you where you've lost light through what is known as vignetting. And you'll see on this image here, all four corners have been vignetted. That's because the light has fallen off sufficiently for you to be quite, for it to be quite visible. You'll also notice we've got these little patches here. These, to my horror, are dust motes. And so each of the images that you will have taken will also have these dust motes on them. But if you can remove them by applying a flat frame to your image, then each of these artifacts, the vignetting and the dust motes, will also be removed from your imaging. Now, I won't go into the detail of this, but whereas I described the other two calibration files, the bias and the dark, as being subtracted, flat frames are actually mathematically divided into the image. But you don't need to really concern yourself about that, because this is all done in software. But the flat frame is tricky to take, but incredibly powerful. To make things easier, I mentioned using a t-shirt stretched over the front of your telescope. That's one way of doing it. I actually take my photographs, or rather my flat photographs, by taking pictures of an electroluminescent screen like this one here. It doesn't really matter what the source is, provided it's evenly lit and that you take it at exactly the same focus position as your original images. And why is it so important? Well, if you have a look at the image on the left, this is an image which has just been partially processed of the whole of NGC 7000. But you can see that quite clearly it's much brighter in the center than it is at the edges. So you can quite clearly see the vignetting. But if you look at the image on the right, this is exactly the same data with nothing more done to it than applying a flat calibration to it before the images were partially processed. And you can see that we've now got a much more even spread of light and a much more pleasing image. So calibration frames are very, very important. Here's a typical image from my location. Look at the light pollution in that. It looks like treacle, doesn't it? Not a lot you can do about light pollution. You can use a light pollution filter, but a lot of the removal of it is done in post-processing. Here's a typical look at what the image will look like once you've actually done some work to remove the light pollution. Again, during this talk, I can't go into the detail of how to do this because it's a subject all on its own. But if these guys will let me come back on another occasion, I'd be very happy to show you how you remove light pollution. But it's typical of the sort of process that you would need to do in your finishing. And here's the image, finally processed, all the light pollution removed, various other little things done to it. Again, this is a very early image of mine, but it pretty much indicates the sort of thing that you can do. You can start off with some really poor data, lots of light pollution, and produce something reasonably attractive. Certainly, I would expect beginners to be able to produce images like this, because this was done when I was a beginner, fairly easily. So many different processes that I could show you, but I'm just going to end on one very, very simple bit of processing. This is the core part of M42. This is typically what an image looks like when it comes straight off the camera. It's actually a color image, but it hasn't been converted to color yet. As you see, the core is completely burnt out. But there's a way of restoring the core and yet still having the fine detail at the end. And that's to take a range of different exposures. So here, we've taken one set of exposures. I don't think I know if I can see the time on it. These are 5-minute exposures. Same object taken again, but this time with, I can't see what it is. I can't tell you exactly, but probably half that exposure time. And you'll see that I've lost some of the detail in the outer part, but the core is starting to resolve a bit better. And then finally, some very short exposures, but unfortunately we've lost all of the outer filamentary stuff, but we've now got the core correctly exposed. But the nice thing about finishing and the post-processing is that you combine all of these together and you end up with an image like that, simply by having a range of different exposures that capture various parts of the image and then combining them all together in Photoshop to produce the finished image. If you like any of the images that you've seen, you'd like to see any more, please feel free to visit my website. If you're at all interested in either of my 2 books, then they can be bought from First Light Optics. Thank you very much. Oh, look at that. One's being held up in front of me. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I hope you found just at least one morsel of interest in there. Thanks again.
Steve, that was great. Thank you very much indeed. There's certainly some enthusiasm for you coming back and doing some more in-depth talks on a whole variety of subjects. I was going to suggest that we just let you carry on talking, but we could have been here for some days, I think, at that point. But certainly, if you are free at some point in the future, Steve, we would love to have you back to go into more in-depth topics.
Thank you very much.
So looking at the chat, lots of things coming up. Does anybody have a specific question for Steve? I haven't seen one come up.
Can I jump in? I've had one sent to me from Ian and Lou already. Why did you give up on your dual imaging rig?
Right. I'm assuming, yes, I'm still live, I can see. I gave up on the dual imaging rig because it's incredibly difficult to point a side-by-side arrangement through the aperture of the observatory that you see before you right now. at various orientations of object, and therefore of the telescope itself, it can be quite a task to get both instruments to point through at the same time. So that was one reason. The other reason was that I had to use two different pieces of capture software, because the software that I have for most of my work, which is Maxim DL, will only control one telescope. But the final straw for me was that I needed to do what is known as dithering. And dithering is a process whereby between each image that you take, you move the camera very slightly off the position of the main object. That way, any hot pixels and other noise are spread randomly about the image, so that when you process them in the stacking process, those artifacts are removed very, very convincingly. But of course, if you move one telescope slightly, when you're doing the dithering, then the other telescope is moving at the same time. So trying to coordinate two cameras to image and dither at the same time became just far too problematical. So that's why I gave up on the dual imaging.
Thanks, Steve, for that.
Thanks, Steve, for that. There's another question come in from Stephen Haythorne, I think it is. Is removal of light pollution something that needs expensive software? No,
not at all. The image that I showed there, albeit an old one and therefore not necessarily one of my best, that software was Photoshop. Photoshop is a relatively expensive piece of software. However, the GIMP, as it's called, rather embarrassingly, will do exactly the same job as Photoshop for removing light pollution, and the GIMP is completely free. So no, you do not need expensive software to remove light pollution.
Excellent. Question regarding, where's it gone? Lots of comments coming up, scrolling up.
The next one was Nigel Bannister. I don't know if you got that one, Daz.
No, go for it.
What's your view on, Steve, what's your view on CMOS sensors? They've been around for years in ordinary cameras, but relatively new for deep sky sensors. Can you comment on CCD versus CMOS? Well, that's a whole talk in itself, isn't it?
It is. Right, can we start the clock again? I'm going to use an hour for this. Right, that's put me nicely on the spot, really. My honest opinion is, at the present time, I think CMOS cameras are very good. I think they are almost there, but for me, I haven't seen anything that would make me want to change from my CCD camera. The biggest advantage that I see with CMOS cameras, apart from their price, because they're cheaper to produce than CCD cameras, is that because of the way they work and the way you can turn up the gain, you can capture more shorter exposures using them, which for my field, which is narrowband, that's my favorite, they're absolutely excellent for narrowband work. But having said that, I'm quite happy with the quality of the data that I get from my existing CCD camera. So for me, at this moment in time, if I was in the market for another camera, I would actually buy a CCD camera. But I suspect that if you were to ask me in perhaps a couple of years' time, I think that's the balance would have changed a little bit. I don't think it would have swung, but I think that CMOS cameras will be much more to the fore than they are currently. That's not to say that a CMOS camera is no good. They are really very good. But for me, a CCD camera does everything that I want it to currently.
Great, thanks, Steve. Oh, there's another 400 pages of scrolling. Anna Hodgson would love to ask Steve thoughts on using filters with one-shot color cameras, such as the Eye-Enhance filter from Optolong.
L-Enhance,
sorry, dodgy eyes. Specsavers.
I haven't actually used that particular filter, so I can't give you an honest first experience comment on it. What I can tell you is that despite what a lot of people will say, that you can't use filters with a one-shot color camera, you most certainly can. There are examples of hydrogen alpha images on my website, admittedly taken a while ago before I got a mono camera, but that were taken using a hydrogen alpha filter, very, very successfully. And although I hear and understand very much the reasons why it's not a very efficient way of imaging because of the matrix of filters that's already built onto the sensor, you can still take very acceptable hydrogen alpha images in particular using a one-shot color camera. The Optolong, again, not having any direct experience of it, I'm afraid I can't tell you how good or otherwise it is. But if it does what it purports to do, which is to zero in on those really important emissions of hydrogen alpha, oxygen 3, and others, then I can't see why it wouldn't be a successful product.
Yes, I have to say I've got a CMOS camera and the L-enhanced filter myself, but unfortunately with work and various other things, I've just not had a chance to use it. So I can't help with that at all, Steve. But
it's worth almost thinking of those types of filters as just sort of a bit more extreme light pollution filters, because they really do narrow down the bandwidths. And it's just worth mentioning there's a new version of the L-enhanced, the L-extreme, which is about to arrive, which narrows down those band passes a little bit more as well.
Okay.
It's worth looking up for.
I can't think why it wouldn't work, because you can certainly use a hydrogen alpha filter. So if you're narrowing down, which is in essence what the Optolong is doing, it should work.
Mm-hmm.
Simple as that.
Yeah. Another question from Gregor Brearley, and this is another question, Steve, that we could spend several hours discussing. But on calibration images, I was wondering how many are needed at a basic level.
At a basic level, if you take 16 or more, that should be more than enough. It becomes a diminishing returns thing after a while anyway. But if you take, ideally, between 16 and 20 bias, dark, and flat frames, that'll be more than adequate for the vast majority of things that you're going to do. So, yeah, ideally, I won't go into the detail, but there's a mathematical advantage to taking 16 or more. There's no great advantage in taking huge quantities. I sometimes see people who've taken 60 or 70. They're really not getting any gain from it. 16 to 20, more than adequate.
Excellent, thank you.
I've had a private one, which was the next one in. Sorry, Darren, in case you didn't.
No, carry on.
John Foster, do you rate any light pollution filters in particular?
Yes, I do. The Hutech IDAS light pollution filters are the ones that I've used with my one-shot color camera, and I found them to be really excellent. Very good indeed. Hutech IDAS.
There we go. That's another one to add to people's shopping list. I can't see. I don't think any more.
I've got a few I made note of. If you haven't got any.
Yeah, go for it.
So Keith Johnson, I noticed you have a greenhouse next to your observatory. Do you get any issues with thermal currents affecting imaging?
If I did, there's nothing I can do about it because it belongs to my wife. No, I'm not aware of having any issues with that. And in fairness, most of my imaging is done to the east and the south, and the greenhouse is very much to the north of the observatory anyway. But no, I haven't particularly noticed any thermal issues because of that.
I've got a whole heap of private ones here, Darren, if you want me to.
You carry on, mate. You carry on.
So Dad's Astronomy, he's got a housekeeping question regarding keeping kit in a dome during summer where it won't get used as much. He's seen temperatures up to 40 degrees Celsius and wondered if that would do any lasting damage to his CCD cameras.
Crikey, 40 degrees, that's quite a lot. One of the reasons that I have a white observatory is not only does it look super cool, but it also reflects heat and light. So a white observatory, of course, is a good way to go. I think if it were 40 degrees, that's a fair old temperature. But I wouldn't have thought that would particularly do any harm. I'd be far more concerned about condensation early in the morning on other occasions than I would, I think, about the temperature. These things are pretty robust, to be honest. condensation would be much more of a concern to me than increased temperature.
Next was from
sorry, Grant. Grant. I was just going to say, Steve, the uber cool observatories are now painted like R2D2, not just plain white. So
the best, the coolest observatory I've seen is from an SGL member who made it look like the TARDIS, as in the police box.
Okay.
That had to be the coolest observatory I have seen. But I know a lot of people have green observatories. I mean, I believe Pulsar, well, I know Pulsar do a green observatory. But I have heard of people complaining that they do get too warm. And I can't honestly say that my observatory gets anything like 40 degrees, even on a really hot day. Mine just does not get anything even remotely close to that. So, you know, white is definitely working for me.
I had another product one, 034886. What is your opinion on using flat darks or dark flats?
The only time I've ever used them has been when I haven't been able to get flats of the right exposure length that I require. One of the problems with a camera like the one I've got is that it has a shutter, a mechanical shutter. And therefore, it's important to make sure that your flats are of an exposure length long enough to make sure that you don't get any artifact from the sweep of the shutter as it goes through. And sometimes it is quite difficult. For example, with that fluorescent screen that I use, to get enough brightness onto a 3 nanometer hydrogen alpha filter. On the odd occasions that I haven't been able to get the correct amount of light that I require, therefore I've had a very long exposure, say something in excess of, let's say, 20 seconds. If my flat was longer than 20 seconds, I would take a flat dark to go with it. If it was under 20 seconds, I just wouldn't bother. Hope that helps.
Another product one, Ian and Lou. I see many images where the sky seems too dark, but I think I leave my images too light. What would you recommend is the best level to aim for your background sky? Okay,
this is a very common thing, and quite often I agree with you. Images are made to look inky black, and I have never seen an inky black sky, even in really out of the way places. What I do using Photoshop is I aim for a background darkness of between 22 and 24. So 22, 23, 24 using the pipette and the curves tool. That seems to me to give a very realistic background sky. And you'll find that the majority of my more modern images have a background of that sort of level. Some of the earliest ones that are on my website, because I've kept literally down to my first images still on my website, some of those were far too black. But in the last 5 years or so, that's what I've aimed for, a pipette value of about 23 is absolutely ideal, but 22, 23, 24 is absolutely fine. Once you start getting over that, I think they start looking over bright. Once you start getting below that, then you're starting to get into, if you like, unrealistic territory.
Great, thank you. Just to let people know, we're working through the questions. I've got Andy in the queue, Happy Cats, Little Guy 80, and Stephen Thornton. I don't know if you've got any more on your list, Grant.
I've got one more private one, and then there was another one before the next people in your list that might have got missed along the way. So the next one was David Banks, and it's sort of a more general one. Given the massive advances in the hobby, addiction, illness is astroimaging over the last 25 years, what do you see on the horizon in the next 25 years?
Oh dear. Well, I started doing full automation fairly early on, and I think that people will probably be moving very much into that, because once you've served your apprenticeship of standing out there freezing yourself to death till 4 o'clock in the morning, and climbing into bed and being kicked out by your other half, for being a block of ice, you do tend to think, well, hang on a second, all the time I'm actually doing the imaging, I don't actually need to do that much because I've got a computer connected, I've got my auto guider working. Do I actually need to be there? And the answer is, well, no, you don't. Of course, what a lot of people do is while they're imaging, they get out their Dobsonian and they have a good look around the skies. I did do that for a while. I have to be honest that I don't anymore. I very much look forward to setting a run going and then going to bed, knowing that I have a fully automated system that if it starts to get cloudy, it'll close everything down. If the cloud goes away, it'll open everything up and start again. So I think that mounts, telescopes, cameras, etc., will become more and more automated so that in fact we don't actually have to be there all the time while we're actually doing the imaging itself. A lot of people will throw their hands up in horror at that, but I do think that that is probably the future. I think that's the way it's going. What you guys can't see at the moment is, or probably can't see, I'm not sure, is the two other people on screen. One of those I know is also aiming at a fully automated system, aren't you, Daz?
Yes, I am aiming.
For the last 3 years, Daz has been aiming for a fully automated system. So yeah, I do rather think that's going to be the future. I think that the manufacturers of the equipment will start to twig that actually this technology doesn't have to be clunky. What can you do to make it more reliable and more automated?
I suspect we can arrange some more talks around those sorts of areas as well. I think there'll be quite a bit of interest.
Yes, I'm sure, yeah.
Okay, moving swiftly on from my shortcomings in following certain examples. So Andy would like to know, how do the light pollution filters cope with the new style LED street lamps that are being installed everywhere?
Not very well, basically. Trouble with the LED lamps is that they are very, very broadband in their nature, and therefore the light pollution filters that were originally designed for for sodium, i.e. the yellow parts of the spectrum, are completely useless when it comes to LED. So it is a very, very big problem, I'm afraid. And I'm a little bit fearful in some ways for the future of light pollution, because of that. I have my own way of completely resolving light pollution, and that's that I image in narrowband.
Narrowband.
I'm not suggesting that everyone should image in narrowband. There's lots of wonderful photography, astrophotography to be done in broadband, but it is a very big problem. The LEDs basically cover the spectrum that we're trying to image, and so if you could filter those out, you'd be filtering out all the stuff that you want as well, unfortunately.
Yeah. Jolly good. Happy Cat has asked about, do the tri-filters L enhance mean you need to take longer exposure lengths? But I think somebody has actually answered that for him, and the short answer is yes. I think you probably do, but I think you said you haven't got specific experience of those earlier, Steve.
No, unfortunately, I can't really comment, but I think that just doing a thought experiment on it, I can't see that it would be anything other than you requiring taking longer exposures.
Yeah. Okay. Little guy 80, otherwise known as Neil, says, fab talk, Steve. Thank you so much. As someone who's just got a DSLR, what would be a sensible starting place to take some basic images and learn processing? Short, single exposures with a lens?
I would say relatively short exposures and lots of them, and stack them, because stacking can be done for free. You can use free software like Deep Sky Stacker, for example. So if you were to use a camera lens, focus the way I recommended when I was doing the F-word focus. Take lots of images, 30 seconds or so, and then stack them together. I think you'd be astonished at some of the beauty that you'll get, especially as we're coming up now to Milky Way season. Now would be an excellent time to start taking those images. You haven't mentioned tracking, Neil. If you don't have a tracking mount, you are going to be limited in your exposure lengths, depending on the focal length that you're actually going to use. For example, if you were using a 50mm camera lens, then exposures somewhere in the region of, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 seconds would probably be adequate before you started seeing any trailing. I think I would try and push the budget a little bit and get some kind of a tracking mount. Skywatcher do an excellent one, designed specifically for use with the digital SLR camera and lenses. If you had one of those, then you could easily take 30-second or more exposures. The important thing is to take lots of them and stack them. That way the signal to noise ratio increases dramatically, and you will be astonished at the quality of images that you can capture.
Excellent, and again, as a unapologetic plug, Dark Art or Magic Bullet, you won't go very far wrong in learning processing with that excellent manual.
Sorry, there was one a few earlier that I think we skipped over from Fierce PC, David Harvey, and he asked any experience with drizzle.
Sorry, David.
No, I don't have any experience of drizzle. I've never found the need to use it. I have a friend who uses PixInsight for his stacking, as indeed do I these days. What I tend to do, just very briefly, is I do all my calibration, alignment, stacking, deconvolution, etc. in PixInsight, and then I move out and back into Photoshop, because for me that works best. And PixInsight is quite strong on drizzle, but looking at the images that my friend, who if you like has been learning PixInsight with me as part of a group, I haven't seen any evidence that that drizzle is doing anything for our images. I'm sure there will be examples of people who have found it useful, but I'm afraid I don't use it and haven't seen any particular need to do so. So sorry, I can't be much more helpful than that, I'm afraid.
No worries, David. I would think a question on the main forum on that is probably better option in that case. Somebody somewhere on SGL is bound to know a more detailed answer on that one. Steve Thornton says, should I be using bias frames with my ASI 1600 CMOS camera? I cannot get a definitive answer online about this because many say CMOS are unstable at very short exposures, and so bias frames make the result worse.
If I had that camera, I wouldn't bother taking bias frames with it. It's one of the things with the CMOS camera that doesn't seem to always work. The bias is the least important of the frames. They can be problematical. You can end up adding artifacts rather than removing them. If it were me and I had that particular camera, I think I would not be taking bias frames, and therefore that would be my answer.
We recommend that you don't take bias because it isn't they're not consistent, the bias frames, so they can add rather than help, but flat darks instead, dark flats, even, whichever way around you want to say.
Yeah,
okay.
I would say that's a good remedy.
Excellent. Okay, and I've got two interesting comments that have come in. One from Terry that says the I-D2 filter, sorry, the I-D2 filters LED quite nicely. So that's an interesting one.
That's a newer filter than the one that I've got. So
okay.
yeah, that could well be the case. Again, haven't had too much experience of the LED issue so much, because these days I tend to take narrowband anyway. That's my main interest.
Yeah, sure. And a topic we touched on before about light pollution and street lights and so on. Daniel actually managed to get in touch with his local council about street lights, and for a modest sum of £60, they came out and actually placed a guard around the street light that was most affecting him. So I think it's always worth contacting your local council if you are suffering from streetlights intruding into your garden too much. At least it's worth having the discussion with them to see if there's anything that they can do.
I've got a couple of private ones here, if I may. Yogesh, he's asked, how do you take care of condensation then? So I think that was back when you were talking about your dome.
Indeed. I run a dehumidifier all the time, and I do mean literally all the time. It's running right now. It runs 24/7. There are two kinds of dehumidifier. There's a refrigerant type of dehumidifier, and there is a desiccant type of dehumidifier. The best one for the purpose is a desiccant type, because that will work down to 0 degrees centigrade, whereas a refrigerant one will only work down to maybe 10 degrees if you're lucky. So that's what I do. I run a dehumidifier, and that does a fantastic job. I probably dehumidify half of West Sussex in the process. But the most important thing is that there is no condensation inside my dome. I don't run the dehumidifier when I'm actually imaging, because part of the way that a desiccant works is that it has a little oven in it, and therefore that oven will generate heat, which means that I'd have a little chimney running inside my dome, which obviously would be bad news because of hot air currents. But that, I'm afraid, is the only solution that's really worked for me. But it has paid dividends. There isn't a scrap of rust on a single piece of my equipment. And that's all down to the dehumidifier. I can remember once when my dehumidifier died on me, and I saw all the moisture running off it. I was nearly in tears. So that is the answer. A dehumidifier. Okay, it increases your expenditure on the hobby, but chances are, if you've got an observatory, you've got some fairly valuable equipment in there anyway. The cost of ownership of a dehumidifier more than pays for itself in the way it looks after your equipment for you.
Thanks, Steve. I've got another private one from Matthew Bay. Why should modern auto guiding be done via software instead of direct connection via ST4 cable to the mount?
There's not a great deal of advantage in the two. I prefer to use the if you like, the software version. In other words, to use the pulse guiding rather than the ST4. The ST4 is fine. It's just a little bit trickier, perhaps, to get it running smoothly. It tends to be a little bit off and on, whereas if you're doing pulse guiding, the pulses can be cranked up or slowed down. It tends to be a smoother way of doing it. Although I don't particularly recommend it, there are advantages, again, with the pulse guiding. If you've got very high resolution encoders, or even if you're using PEC. Personally, I don't see any point in using PEC if you're going to be guiding. But if you did want to use PEC, PEC is periodic error correction. Then if you were to use ST4 at the same time, you would find that the two would be fighting one another. Whereas if you use pulse guiding, then the error correction that's applied by the PEC system that you're running, and the extra input from the pulse guiding work together to give you, if you like, a single pulse that takes the PEC pulse into consideration. Sorry, I haven't explained that particularly well, but it's just a smoother way of guiding, and it's the only way to work if you're already using periodic error correction.
Any more from you, Grant? I've got 2 more on my list.
You might have the same ones as me on my list. So do you want to?
So Robin Arnold would like to know, is there a guide scope that will work with the Edge 11?
I've used an Edge 11, and very much to my surprise, using a finder scope actually worked quite well with it. I think you've got to be careful not to have too much of a disparity between the focal lengths of your guide scope and your SCT. You'd probably be better off using an off-axis guider, the SCT. Yeah. That would be the way that I would do it. But if there's a reason why you can't do that, then I would have thought that something in the region of about a 500mm focal length guide scope would be fine. But I've had some very, very good results just using a finder scope. Again, flies in the face of what you would expect, but it actually worked very, very well. I don't think I'll get too hung up on it, really. I think provided you're doing some guiding, you will see dramatic improvements in the image quality. So it's not a huge deal, but clearly the longer the focal length of the guide telescope, the theoretical chances are that you'll get a better guide.
Great. Okay, Robin, I hope that helps. And then finally on my list is another one from Keith Johnson, actually, Grant. Hi again, regarding another light pollution, i.e. satellites, in particular Starlink. Hey, there's a topic that we could talk about for a long time. Is there a way of removing them or any software in development of removing them from our images?
I'm not aware of any software currently available, but I firmly believe that if it becomes a major problem, someone will fairly quickly come up with an algorithm to resolve it. The majority of star trails are removed very satisfactorily by using a stacking process specifically designed to obviate those sort of artifacts. The Starlink is a little bit more difficult because they really are very, very bright. But I have a feeling that the Starlink issue is probably going to go away a little bit once the thing's actually properly implemented and their final altitudes and so on. There's loads up there at the moment. I haven't had a problem with them, and I've still been imaging in the last few months. And I can't say that my images are giving me any more grief than they used to. I'm certainly getting satellite passes very, very frequently, but they are disappearing in the stacking process equally quickly. So I'm not sure that it's going to be the horrendous problem that we all thought it was. I mean, I'd rather they weren't there. Clearly.
Well, indeed, yeah.
But I think there will be workable solutions in the future, and I think some of those workable solutions are already in the software that we're currently using in stacking.
Yeah, indeed. Nigel Bannister points out Sigma clipping as part of the stacking process is good for this, and PixInsight has a process called local normalization. If you've not come across this, that also works well for these sorts of things as well. And there are some new features in PixInsight in the stacking algorithms that do a really good job on satellite and plane trails. And of course that's in constant development as well. So do keep an eye on your news for that.
And it's interesting, Ian Lou saying Starlink is the only satellite trail I've had that Sigma clipping doesn't clean up. So maybe it is just that much brighter.
Oh, there we go. Okay. That sounds like another topic all by itself, is to work out how we're going to do that. Dad's astronomy. He's off to go and talk to his wife, because he now believes that his green observatory should indeed be white. So he's going to go off and have that conversation.
I've got a private question here from Samantha. I have a Bressa HD camera for planetary imaging and recording. When using a Newtonian reflector, does it need to be collimated each time before use?
I'm guessing it's not in an observatory, so I guess the honest answer is yes. If you want the best quality images, you really ought to collimate a Newtonian each time that you're going to use it, because just the very nature of the way they're built, the way they're put together, it's so easy for something to become slightly out of alignment. And if it's out of alignment, then your images won't be to the same quality. But normally it just requires, you know, the minimum of work, normally just on the primary mirror. So it's well worth putting in that maybe 5 minutes of work just to get it at its peak.
You start to get a feel for your own instruments as well, don't you? So you sort of know what tweak it's likely to need and can almost preempt it a little bit.
Very much so.
I think that's all the questions I've got.
I think that's all the questions I've got as well. So
can I ask one?
Well, I don't know.
Please.
Is it a trick question?
It was. What do you? I didn't quite catch it. Do you use an off-axis? What do you use at the moment? Off-axis guiding or separate guide scope?
I use off-axis guiders on both of my telescopes, but I use the telescopes separately now. I make a conscious decision. Tonight I'm going to use my Esprit 150. Another night I will use the William Optics FLT 98, both of which have got off-axis guiders on them. I really like an off-axis guider. The big advantage of an OAG over a second telescope is that it practically guarantees that you won't get what is known as differential flexure. Differential flexure is when, no matter how tightly bolted the two telescopes are together, there's a tiny amount of movement between them. Just the pull of gravity is enough to do that. If you have an off-axis guider, there's hardly any weight involved, and therefore the whole system, if you like, becomes much more solid. And therefore, an off-axis guider will tend to give you the best guiding that you can get.
I think it makes it nice also to be able to move your imaging rig from scope to scope, because you just move one chunk.
Absolutely, just lift off the whole thing. Yeah, that's quite right.
We do have one late entrance on the, or in fact possibly two on the questions. Yeah. Did Steve mention cloud sensors? Would he recommend one for a dome? In fact, I can answer this question. If you look very carefully at the picture of Steve's observatory, just in front, there looks like to be an ice cream box upturned. Steve, would you care to explain that a little more?
Yes, underneath that ice cream box, which is, I've got my mouse on it now. If you lift that off, under there is an AAG cloud watcher. I haven't tried any other. I can only tell you that the AAG cloud watcher works really well for me. The backup that you get from the manufacturer is second to none. They're absolutely brilliant. It just works. It just works really well. Why is mine under an ice cream container? I've got this funny feeling that if the sun falls on it for too long, the plastic's going to go hard and brittle, and I'm going to have a problem. So I've got an ice cream container lined with tin foil. So that stops any light during the day falling on the plastic box of the AEG Cloud Watcher itself. So that's why it's under an ice cream container. But that is a very popular unit. I'm in a very small imaging group of people who have very, very similar equipment. We all have the same dome. We have similar cameras, and so on. We all use the AEG Cloud Watcher. We all swear by it rather than at it. And therefore, it would, if I had to recommend one, the one I'm using is absolutely great. So that would be the one.
It's what Pixel Sky is using in Spain as well, which is where we have our remote imaging rig.
Oh, is it?
So all of the remote stuff over there, it all runs off AAG stuff. It's very good.
I have one myself, and it is very good. It is very good. And one final sneaky question, unless anybody else has a final sneaky question. Belt drive mods, Steve. Any experience on those? Are they worth the outlay?
I haven't had the mod. Or I haven't had one with the mod itself. I've heard, unfortunately, only anecdotally, generally, that they can be very good or they can have absolutely no effect at all. I think so much depends on who actually does the mod for you. I mentioned my little imaging group earlier. one of the members there has finally given up with his belt drive modded telescope, and I think he's going to use it for visual work only, because it's just no good.
Okay.
I'm not sure that it's a big enough issue to actually pay an awful lot of money to have the belt mod done. I can see advantages to having it, but if it's all to do with trying to get better tracking, then just auto-guide. Auto-guiding solves the vast majority of tracking issues. So for me, I think I'd rather put my money into a decent auto-guiding system than into trying to make the mount work in its native form any better.
Can I do my little sales bit?
Yeah, you do it.
It's worth saying, HEQ5s have come a long way. So I think where the belt mod kit does very well is if you're upgrading an old mount, because it gives you that opportunity to just, check it all and tweak it all at the same time. New HEQ5s are much better built, is maybe the wrong word, but that, we don't have issues with sticky grease and all that kind of stuff anymore. But what the belt modding does, it makes them a lot quieter, which may or may not be an issue for you. The other thing it does is it takes away the chatter in the gears. So again, I don't have any graphs or data for this. This is maybe anecdotal, but the feedback is that it makes guiding easier because it takes away some of the irregular chatter between the gears, which is harder to guide out. So it makes your guiding a bit smoother. I think with the HEQ5s, it's a much simpler upgrade and mod, and therefore much cheaper than the EQ6 version, which is a real pain in the backside to do. It's a complete strip down, motors out, everything out. So the HEQ5 is a better sort of candidate for belt modding.
Okay. That's interesting that you mentioned the EQ6 versus the HEQ5. My only direct experience of the belt drive being a pain in the backside, as you said, it was actually with an EQ6, not an HEQ5.
Yeah.
And that was the guy in the imaging group. But I am a great believer in guiding, resolving an awful lot of the ills that we have to put up with mounts and so on. I've got a stupidly expensive mount that I still guide with. I could have continued with my very old black EQ6 that I upgraded so it had a hand controller, and I would probably be taking exactly the same quality images that I am now, simply because I'm auto guiding with it. But you're absolutely right with regard to noise and so on. The belt drive that turns a coffee grinder into a very sweet running sewing machine, and there's a lot to be said for that. In theory, if you're hearing noise, then that means that there's something mechanically strained, if you like, or mechanically hitting, chipping, whatever. I can see that there must be some advantages in doing it, but I wasn't aware that particularly the HEQ5 was easier to mod than the EQ6.
Yeah,
that's actually possibly quite significant.
It's also just worth saying, if you wanted about modded EQ6, there's no point paying. You may as well just go for an EQ6R, which already has belts in, out the box. So you wouldn't really want to mod a new EQ6. It's probably better for the sort of ones that have been out there a long time. I know I've got a sort of 12-year-old one now that's modded, and it has made it run very sweet.
Right.
Cool. There's a bit of a discussion going on over the built mod. So I think it's very much, as you said earlier, some people get good results and others perhaps not getting quite the results they expected. Some of it's going to come down to age and condition of the mount, I guess, and that sort of thing. So okay, that's one I think for an ongoing discussion, perhaps for the.
I've got a private question that's just popped up, Darren. Sorry.
Yeah, carry on.
Is Microsoft Remote Desktop a good choice for a remote mini PC in situ on telescopes?
Unfortunately, the computer that I've got in my observatory is an old desktop machine, and I've always had desktop or floor standing computers in my observatory. Therefore, I haven't actually tried with one of the smaller PCs. All I can tell you is that remote desktop is exactly what I use to control every facet of my remote imaging sessions. I found it to be really good. I've only actually been using it for about the last 6 months. Before that, I was using TeamViewer, but I fell foul of the TeamViewer's policy of accusing people like me of using their software commercially, which in fact I wasn't. So I had to find a solution, and remote desktop has worked really well for me. So if it will work on your operating system, and that is quite an important consideration, I found remote desktop to be really good. The only thing that you then need to do is to find a way of actually firing up the PC remotely over your local area network. And there are various free pieces of software that will allow you to do that. I think the one I'm using is called Tradewinds, which simply sends a magic packet down the LAN, which is picked up by the sleeping PC, turns the PC on. Once it's turned on, you then access it using remote desktop. But I found remote desktop to work extremely well. Yeah. So I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't want to use it.
The disadvantage also are things like TeamViewer, unless you have some sort of elaborate PC set up on spare PC set up on the network. Of course, it needs an internet connection. Otherwise, you can't talk to the remote desktop, which is a bit of a downside. But no, yeah, RDP works great, and if you're running a slightly older version of the operating system, so if you're running Windows 7, although you just say it's a mini PC, so it's probably likely to be on Windows 10, you just need to make sure that the security protocols are right between the two machines, just to make sure that works okay. But it doesn't take much figuring out.
I'm just going to add that if you wanted to, but remote desktop is if you're on the same network. But if you were, say, remotely from your setup completely, then it's worth looking at Chrome have a remote desktop free app, and also Splashtop is what we use at the moment, and that works very well.
Any PC is also another good one. That's free, possibly slightly more intrusive than the others, but it does work.
There's another one as well, by the way, that if I want to operate my system completely remotely, not on the same network, I use AnyDesk.
Sorry, that was what I was thinking of, not any PC. It was PC. Okay. Yeah, no, it was AnyDesk. Sorry, Steve. Yes.
Anything but TeamViewer, is that?
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, yeah. Someone said don't mention TeamViewer, and yeah, quite right too. Quite right too.
Robin's just said real VNC. Yeah, I've used Tight VNC in the past, which is almost like an open source version of Microsoft RDP.
There's a question come up that's probably not quite so Astro related, but very serious. Where have you guys managed to get your hair cut? They're called Children, and they do a very good job.
or not in my case.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We won't go there. We won't go there. The special COVID cut, indeed. Thanks, Spikey. Right, I think we are now at the end of the serious questions. So I think with that, I am going to say, Steve, many thanks indeed for being our very first presenter for Stargazine. Thanks very much indeed for giving up your time. Thank you everybody for joining. Just for interest, at one point we had over 140 people online, which is fantastic. Thank you all for your questions. All of the questions. Some were really interested. We'll find out about the barber bit, and we'll post details about where you can hire children. No, I shouldn't be saying that, should I? No. Anyway, so
Helen just wants to interject.
Oh,
you unmuted me so that I can clap you, Steve.
Indeed, a round of applause for Steve, virtual or otherwise. Steve, thanks very much indeed. Just to remind people, next Sunday we have our second session, and we have got Nick, and I sincerely hope I get this right, Zimmernick is talking to us. And I think the topic is
I've got
DSLR.
I've got an update. I've got a title
we have
that
an
I can
update.
give everybody. So next week is going to be Adventures in Astro Image Processing, which is going to cover digital SLR, Milky Way imaging, wide field image processing. So it should dovetail quite nicely with what Steve's been talking a little bit about tonight, and take it a bit further along.
Sounds really good.
Fantastic.
Look forward to that.
And again, we'll publish all the details in the new section on the forum. So again, thank you all very much indeed. Grant, thanks for doing all the technical wizardry.
Thank you, Daz.
Thanks for Flo for doing all their bit and supporting us. And Steve, thank you again. Been great to hear the talk.
Well,
See you all soon.
Thank
Thanks
you
all.
for inviting me. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.